We're going to move now to a kind of treatment, which is called a clinical trial. And Dr. Trico, I would like perhaps to have you at least talk a little bit about where do you think the best places are for patients to learn about clinical trials?
We basically distinguish 4 different types of trials. A phase 1 trial is where you take all types of cancers and you try to find the maximum tolerated dose. You don't look for efficacy, but you want to know the maximum tolerated dose. It's clear that patients who have a lot of other options still open are not candidates for this type of trials, because the probability that they will do well is extremely low, and it's very likely that they will have no response to this treatment. The phase 2 trial, now you go to one disease and you want to see what the efficacy is. And then you go to a phase 3 trial where you combine your new treatment to the best alternative treatment. So, and then you have a phase 4 trial, but most of the trials are phase 1, 2, or 3. And they have each their role, but people should not expect from a phase 1 trial to be cured of their disease. It's extremely unlikely. It's single-agent drug, which is already not good. Typically, those patients have already had multiple relapses, are very refractory to those drugs. And now you start with a single drug and you try to see whether it has an impact on the disease. It typically doesn't have in a phase 1 trial. In a phase 2 trial, where you have found the dose, you can see some effects, although they are usually of short duration. It's actually the phase 3 trials that give us the most information, but also need the longest follow-up, and they are the most important long-term outcomes come from those phase 3 trials.
So, Dr. Trico, that was a great explanation of the different phases in trials and how they're targeted. And Dr. Van Rhee, sort of where in a treatment protocol do you see clinical trials? At what stage?
Actually, at all stages of therapy, clinical trials are relevant. We have a trial specifically for high-risk patients, where we incorporate daratumumab with carfilzomib up front. They get daratumumab between transplants immediately after transplant, and we give in combination of carfilzomib, Revlimid, and Dex as a maintenance strategy. Historically, with our high-risk patients, and I think this applies to all centers, this group of patients with very high-risk disease is very difficult to tackle, and innovative approaches are needed there. Obviously, with the lower risk patients, the question is how we can safely scale back on therapy and still have excellent outcomes. And the other question there is how can we identify patients with so-called low-risk disease who unexpectedly have an early relapse. We sometimes refer to them as the misfits, the patients who are supposed to do well and they don't. So that's an important category of patients to identify. Then there are questions about transplantation, questions about what consolidation to give, what maintenance. So at every stage of therapy, of upfront therapy, clinical trials are being conducted. And obviously, the relapse setting is extremely important to find efficacious drugs and drug combinations, which then later on can be incorporated in frontline approaches. Because clinical trials are incredibly important at every stage of the disease.
So I urge patients to be on the lookout for an opportunity. Dr. Atrash, I'm wondering, are you, with your patients, if they're curious about getting informed themselves and educating themselves about trials in each of these phases, where do you suggest that they look?
Oh, sure. So there is the clinicaltrial.gov is the website that has all the clinical trials all over the United States. However, it can get a little bit confusing. So if you want to make it simple, I would strongly suggest that you get a discussion with your physician. As we just discussed, each clinical trial has a different goal. So patients must understand why they are joining this trial. Some trials, as we talked, are phase 1 clinical trial. The goal is to find an effective dose. So patients will not be randomized. Patients will not be combined with getting drugs, multiple combinations of drugs. If that's the goal, then that's the goal. It's completely different than a phase 2 trial where you have established dose and you're trying to either combine it with something else or give it by itself. So it's important to discuss why I'm getting into this trial. What is the downside of this, of getting enrolled in this trial, and what's the benefits from it? Mm-hmm. To me, almost always the benefits of any clinical trials way better than the losses or the downside of getting enrolled. Not only it will give us information for the future, the patients who get enrolled in the clinical trial, they will be the first to get benefits out of that drug if it is working. So if we start phase 1 trial today, for example, or any monoclonal antibody today, we will not get it approved for another 4 or 5 years. But patients on clinical trial, they're already getting the benefits out of this drug. And you could tell once you check with your doctor, some drugs we know they are working. We just have to prove it. We just have to make sure it's safe for the patients. So that's very important to check with your physician to see which trials are best for you and which trials are available in a center close to you.
So that idea of having the partnership with your doctor to understand the landscape of clinical trials is really great. I know in my support group, we have members that really want to get themselves informed. They talk with their doctors, but they also look at things like Spark Cures or HealthTree. These are other patient-led organizations that are looking to make it easier to try to figure out those questions that all of you have raised about how do I know which one is right for me. Dr. Van Rhee, I just in terms of the clinical trials that we run, what are we seeing more and more African Americans in these trials, and if so, what are the success rates that you're encountering?
To be frank, I think that there is still a lot of disparity in outcomes with regards to African Americans and African Americans accessing both healthcare and clinical trials. And I think that's an area where the whole myeloma community, both patient advocates, doctors, and pharma really need to make an effort to make these trials more accessible to the minority populations. There are issues of health coverage. There are issues of being able to travel to a center where you can get a clinical trial, especially in a rural state like Arkansas. Sometimes patients live several hours away, and just getting to a center is a problem. I think it's a very important question, and it requires a very concerted effort to improve access to clinical trials for African Americans and other minorities.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is an ongoing.
Can I add something to that?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So the studies have been done where African Americans and Caucasians got the same treatment. When they get the same treatment, they have the same outcomes. So if the outcome in African Americans is lower, is not as good as in Caucasians, it's only due to socioeconomic issues. It has nothing to do with African Americans have more resistant myeloma than non-African Americans. It has to do with socioeconomic factors. And we need to make sure that as many people as possible get optimal treatment and are in a situation where they can afford it. And that's not always possible. It's important to know that African Americans do equally well compared to Caucasians if they get the right treatment or the same treatment.
Okay, one last question. In this domain of clinical trials and things that are upcoming, what excites you about what's in the pipeline?
I think the immunological therapies are very interesting. The antibodies which are currently available, then the antibodies which carry a drug, they're like a silver bullet. The antibody flies to the tumor and delivers a chemical there very specifically, and then there are these bispecific antibodies which attach to the tumor and with their other arm grab an immune cell and activate it. And the advantage of these antibody therapies that they're available off the shelf. The CAR T cells are also very exciting therapies and very innovative, but there are some logistical issues in delivering these in terms of manufacturing them, and undoubtedly some of these therapies are will get approved this year and will be more generally available. There have been some relapses with these CAR T cells, but also the exciting thing, obviously, that we're only dealing with the first wave of CAR T cells, and that these CAR T cells can be made a lot better as well in future.
The results with tendon transplants and at least 2 or 3 years of maintenance therapy with triple drugs are excellent. So you don't want to enter patients that have excellent prognosis into trials that may decrease actually their chances of doing well. And when I say the results are excellent, I mean in the patients who have low-risk disease, not in high-risk disease. High-risk disease patients clearly are not doing well with the present treatments. And it's absolutely justified for new patients to go on trials that address the high-risk features of the myeloma.
The perspective of the patient regarding clinical trials is completely different. So your likelihood, we always say start with triplet chemotherapy and avoid doublet chemotherapy. But if you have a patient with doublet, means 2 drugs, any 2 drugs you choose, if the patient achieves complete remission with 2 drugs only, that's the patient. As a physician, I can share with you that the likelihood of getting into complete remission is higher if you give 3 drugs. That doesn't mean 2 drugs cannot get you to a complete remission. I don't have a magic stick to tell whether 2 drugs will be good enough for you. And the same applies for achieving complete remission. I want to reach out to the patients out there, don't get discouraged. Because yes, we know if you achieved complete remission, your likelihood of living longer is higher. But that doesn't mean every person that should achieve complete remission. And I've seen cases, I'm sure all of us seen cases, where patients did not achieve complete remission, and yet they are living happily and their disease is just stable as it is, and that's okay. And if you get a patient, even if you look at the clinical trials, they compare 3 drugs versus 2 drugs. Well, if you look at the arm who got 2 drugs, they still not everybody progress immediately. Some patients stay in remission for a very long time. But your likelihood of achieving better results is if you get complete remission and is if you do 3 drugs. That's the only, for a patient is completely different perspective. Patient is 100% of the data.
Thank you.